to anyone who is watching this later, I suppose. Thank you for joining us. And thanks for bearing with me and my housekeeping. I will now pass over to Ray.
Thanks, Amy. And hello to everyone that's joined us today. It's really good to see some familiar and some not so familiar faces. My name is Ray and I'm the chair for today. I'm just going to introduce the panel a little bit and set some context, and then we'll hear from our panel members. So lived experience leadership it's a term that I think is fair to say that it's deeply contentious within the survivor, user, refuser movements that I try and occupy at least. So much so that when Ensign invited me to write this report on lived experience leadership for Mind and Ensign, I was a little bit nervous, like really nervous, maybe scared. But the funny thing is the idea that those of us who have lived experience of stuff, that we try and do stuff to change stuff, that's old hat, really. We've been doing this for as long as there's been survivors in a mental health system. And it feels pretty solid to me. But in putting together the report, what I found was there were some people for whom this term, this concept of lived experience leadership had a really visceral reaction. People talked about feeling physically sick, angry, that it was toxic, the sense of the potential of using power over others when we've been oppressed and had power used over us in many, many different contexts. This idea of ego, of the icon, around the hierarchy that so many of us are trying to escape because as a very hierarchical systems have often not served us particularly well. There's this concern around stamping over others to get your voice heard. And who wants to do that? Not me. And yet there was also people who spoke about it being this beacon of hope, this sense that all the crap that I'm going through now can have a purpose, that I can use some of the stuff I'm learning along my journey to help others and to try and make changes that I can see need making. There's people for whom this term is like a breath of fresh air. And then there's loads of people in the middle for whom the focus isn't about what term we use, it's just on getting stuff done because there's so much that needs to get done. My take on this is I still don't know. It was really interesting talking to lots and lots of people. I kind of almost find the term leadership a bit of a red herring in a way, because I've never wanted to be a leader. But sometimes I sit there and see, oh my God, stuff needs to change. Can we gather people around? Can we do something about this? And I think all of the panel members in various different forms have done some of this work, whatever they choose to call it. Before I get the panel to introduce themselves, I just want to make clear that we're not speaking for everybody in this room or everyone in the world. It's really important that there's many different voices heard in this because it's such a contentious area. And I hope that some of you might type in the chat and share some of your thoughts, ideas and questions, and that we'll have some space to bring that in. You might have noticed that there's a glaring hole in our panel today. That's Dan Papoulias. Unfortunately, they're not able to join us today, but they have given us a statement that I'm just going to read out before the introductions. I very regretfully had to withdraw my participation today. I was honoured to be invited on this wonderful panel with people I very much admire and respect. However, the University College Union, of which I'm a member, has declared a strike between December the 1st and 3rd this academic term, with a view to continuing in the new year if our demands are not heard. We fight against the worsening of conditions in our sector, against the normalisation of precarious contracts, working way beyond the contract to stay employable, gender and ethnicity pay gaps, the worsening of disability pay gaps, and the making of pensions and a dignified old age into a privilege only a few are worthy of. The government has just passed a bill to criminalise protest. We know our bosses want our rights gone too. one vice-chancellor apparently said, "I don't care if it's bloody as long as the blood spills within the union." Today, we fight to show that we have the power to refuse and to unite in comradeship. Every fight is a small part of the bigger fight, to nurture solidarity and, in the face of this murderous government, to hold each other alive and in care of each other. So that's the words of Stan, not myself. But whew, what a powerful way to start a panel. Gives me, I feel the loss of them not being here, but yeah, I'm also really excited to introduce those that we have in the room today with us. What I'm going to do is invite them to introduce themselves in turn and just say for a few minutes a little bit of their connection to this topic, lived experience leadership, and then we'll go from there. So the first person I'd like to invite to speak is Tamar.
Hey, hi. So my name's Tamar Jeans. You might know me on Twitter as either Tamar White or Tamar White Jeans, which I put together as a bit of a joke, really, because I thought it was funny. But anyway, my connection to leadership, I tend to think of as almost a little bit accidental, really. And it's kind of because rather than setting out to be a leader, it's more to do with not so much being a follower or kind of more reacting against what I feel is kind of unfair leadership. So I think there's more something really about than other people that feel the same kind of following that too. So some of the work that you might know me for, apart from doing that on Twitter all the time, is Mad Studies group in Birmingham, which is online, and we look at mad literature once a month, and also LXP Revolution, which founded again in Birmingham along with some other people. It's kind of a generally anonymous. I'm one of the few people just sort of is open about being part of that, but again that's something that looks at some of the the darker side of LXP working and looking for equality towards that. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Tamar. Jess, would you like to go next?
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me here. So I first want to say that I don't kind of identify with the term leader. From reading your report, Ray, the term activist is one that I am most closely comfortable with aligning myself with. I've just ended managing the Home Voices team at Mind in Camden, and they do take quite a central role in terms of like ethical peer support practice within the UK and kind of a part of the wider Home Voices movement. So yeah, so now working in peer development at Manchester Mind, and yeah, this work takes me into many statutory organisations, training and mentoring staff within kind of prisons, etc. But yeah, I've been working within the voluntary sector since 2013 in various large charities, but also some smaller ones. I'm also an integrative psychotherapist, practicing with a socio-political framework, but I did peer work before that and only really found myself training to be a psychotherapist because I was told not to engage with people around their stories, really, the old, like, you're not clinically trained. So being kind of the type of person I am, I went and got clinically trained, but now I find myself doing more peer work than clinical work. That's where my passion lies. But yeah, so I've got lived experience of mental health distress, and my brother is in and out of hospital fairly regularly. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was 14, and I see things in quite a systemic way. So me and him are very kind of tightly together on this journey, I suppose. yeah, seeing him go in and out of the system has made me kind of critique it. But then in terms of kind of what brings me to this panel, you know, thinking critically about lived experience leadership or working within these systems, and the one I'm going to be focusing mostly on is the voluntary sector, I've had mixed experiences. Some have been brilliant, but I've also kind of witnessed exploitation and gaslighting. And I feel like lived experience is really, really good for organisations if you agree with them or if you agree with the people that are leading them. But as soon as you don't, you're positioned as mad, angry, and unreasonable. And, you know, so I can think systemically about the reasons for that. But it's, you know, it's hard. It's really hard. So imposter syndrome, burnout, etc. But yeah, I'm still here, just about.
Thank you, Jess. And I'm sure we're going to get some chance to talk about those really important themes that you've started to bring up as well. Sharanjit, would you like to go next?
Hi everyone, my name is Sharanjit Singh. I'm the founder and director of an organisation called Taraqi, which works with Punjabi communities to reshape approaches to mental health. Founded Taraqi about 4 years ago, informed by my experiences of mental health challenges, particularly in my transition from home, which for me is Birmingham, to kind of out of Birmingham as I was kind of going into my undergrad. I guess for me, my kind of experiences to date around lived experience, kind of work with a number of different organisations to support lived experience involvement work, including working with the Welcome Mental Health team, kind of supporting a number of different strategic kind of roles. And I've kind of just found myself in this space in a way that I wouldn't have thought probably a few years ago. And so I'm very much kind of learning and absorbing from, folks on this panel, others that we come across in this type of mental health landscape. And I guess when we had the conversation around lived experience leadership, I get a thing from my family where I automatically push from authority. And so as soon as someone's talking about a leader, I was like, no, thank you. How can we view this in a way that is hold folks to account for their actions rather than just words? And so for me, I've seen so much hypocrisy that has just kind of really not sit well with me in various ways. And so, I'm excited to think about the term, what is helpful, what's unhelpful within the term, and ultimately how we can move towards a system that is equitable, one where resources are more fairly allocated, one where more folks have access to choice, are able to kind of live their lives how they want to. Whether that's called lived experience leadership, whether that's something else, it's that goal that I'm kind of focused and zoned in on.
Thank you. And Bethan, from you.
I'm quite nervous, actually. Hello, everybody. I've always been quite vocal, actually, about the fact that I don't like the word leadership. In fact, I think I gave you a sick emoji, Ray, on Twitter. So I think I reflect kind of what members of the panel have already said. Like I kind of rebel against strict type of authority. So the word leadership for me, I'm not really a fan of, and I associate it with ideas and theories of leadership and management have come a lot from business and individual forms of leadership. And those kind of theories dominate how we perceive and how it's enacted in practice. And I think that those values don't necessarily reflect what we should be doing in the survivor community. So I really enjoyed reading your report, Ray, because I think it covered a whole range of perspectives, and you did it extremely well. So I also don't like the word because I think of the power that is inherent often in traditional forms of leadership, which can be harmful. And a lot of people in the mental health community have experienced the negative consequences of people abusing power, and also services as well. So, and the power that they have over us. So I kind of mainly associate with the staff doing stuff, being an activist, trying to change the agenda, challenge things that don't appear right from outside the system. So about 10 years ago, when I first started doing service user involvement, I generally did mainstream things, going to NHS and being parts of panels and stuff like that. But after a few years, I realised that I wasn't really getting very far, and what I was saying wasn't really being taken on board. And that's when I went all rogue and went down, I found out about user-led groups, for example, Recovery in the Bin. And since then I helped set up Mad COVID, and I'm part of the Stop Sim Coalition. And I campaigned against the Calm trial as well. And all of these things are outside the system. And I find it way more liberating doing stuff outside the system. I feel I can achieve a lot more. So that's my perspective.
Thank you. I love what you say about going rogue. It just gave me this little woof, for some reason. It's just this idea of liberation. But it brings us to the first question that I guess I've got for you, which is, how did you guys get into something that might be called leadership or activism, or whatever word you want to put on it? And do you have a sense of why it's important that those of us who go through stuff get to do stuff? You can tell I'm already coming away from the leadership word. You can bring that in if you want. Has anyone got anything they want to speak to around that?
I guess, Tamaka.
There's a whole sort of how do we dance together? If we're sitting in a room, it'd be so much easier.
I was panicking then. I couldn't find the unmute button. Well, I could find the unmute button. I just couldn't find the mouse. But anyway, sorry. So when it comes into how you got into something, I was just thinking of Mad Studies and how that started in Birmingham. And it kind of started really in trying to meet a need or answer a problem. So on the first hand, it was because I just finished my MSc, and part of that had meant that I've been doing reading, and part of that was sort of applying that to the work that I was doing as a lived experience professional. And we'd often sort of look at papers in a group, and I find it very hard to kind of like reading on your own and kind of like keeping that up on your own, and you're not on a course and you're not studying. So I kind of part of me had wanted to be doing that, and the other part had really been seriously worried about the lived experience workers locally, because what I'd noticed was that they'd been trained sort of through the institution. It's in like there was no connection basically back to the lived experience communities, no connection back to our history, understanding that the work they were doing had come from kind of activism, where the roots came from. And when it came that they were really, really struggling with the work that they were doing, they didn't really understand why, and they were kind of blaming themselves and all sorts of different things, where if they had the knowledge as to where some of these things came from and the dynamics behind them, they would actually it would support them a lot better. So that was where the idea came from to start it all up. And so it was kind of this act of defiance, really, because I kind of suggested it within the inside, yeah. And no one was listening to me inside. So it was kind of like a big, on YouTube, I don't want to spoil the thing, but it's a bit, maybe there are a few fingers involved, and I was thinking, yeah, I'll just do it myself. And so kind of started it up, and people must have liked it because I came along. So yeah.
Thank you, Tamar. It took me a while to get the fingers, and I was like, oh yes, I'm there now.
Yeah,
little glitch.
Yeah, I don't want to get your video taken down by YouTube or whatever, defunded, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, very considerate. Shiranjit, were you wanting to come in as well?
Yeah, I think it's a funny one, because I reflect on my experiences of, say, lived experience leadership compared to other opportunities for leadership I've had. And I recognize the huge, immense privilege I've had in kind of, whilst growing up, to consider myself to be someone who is, I don't know, confident enough, or, I perceive myself as capable enough to step into those positions. And for me, there's this really interesting contrast where, before kind of lived experience related work, it was almost like my understanding or view of leadership was very almost like Napoleonic in a way, in a strange way, in a very unsurprising way as well, when you think about how we see leadership generally in kind of popular culture and stuff. But it was actually only through lived experience related leadership that I was able to take more of a conscientious approach to how I'm engaging with the landscape, how I'm engaging with others, and how I'm positioning myself in relation to that as well. And so I think my understanding of, whether it's leadership or we call it something else, has been entirely changed through kind of lived experience related work, engaging with folks in this landscape, in these communities. And that's just been a really interesting contrast on my side, as someone who's benefited from different kinds of privilege in the past, and seeing how that really does not provide you with what actually works, but provide you with something that makes you think it works. And so yeah, it's a interesting contrast.
Thank you. That always gets me. I'm often really aware of my own privilege, of the sense of, I believe that my voice matters and I'm happy to speak up. And that is like something that cannot be taken for granted. At the same time, I have lots of voices in me that say that I shouldn't speak up, that it's always a bit more complicated than that. But thanks, Shiranjit. Bethan or Jess? Jess.
I was just going to say, I relate to that kind of feeling of kind of luck that has meant that I've ended up where I've ended up. One of my first therapists when I was 13, he was part of the Hearing Voices movement in its early inception in Manchester. And so being supported by somebody that was open about their diagnosis and was a bit CBT-ish, but also was very political, and made me feel like I was okay and the issue wasn't within me. That was really formative. And I think that in a way I've like grown up in the Hearing Voices movement, and it's just kind of circumstance that meant that I found my way to Mind in Camden, and that I was supported by people in that movement to speak up. And I think that has been really, really important to me, like one of the main reasons why I've found a voice within the movement. And I think that, for me, although kind of at uni I did learn about kind of critiquing mainstream models of mental health and how Eurocentric and biased they were, there have been people recently that have listened and understood my perspective when it comes to racism within the lived experience field. And, systems are systems, and all systems have hierarchies. But yeah, reflecting on the impact of that, but also the opportunities that it gives me to speak, you know, as somebody that is Black within the movement, because there aren't enough of us. But yeah, I think, you know, there's so much in terms of kind of my family, my kind of trajectory through the mental health system, and kind of the work within the Hearing Voices movement that has led me to this. And it's made me realise that I don't have to kind of mimic mainstream approaches, that this way of doing things is very respected, and that's from seeing kind of elders within the movement. So although I'm critiquing lived experience leadership, to have elders within the movement has been very important to me in feeling like I could speak up. So yeah, I don't know, that's a bit contradictory maybe, but yeah.
That's really interesting to me as well. Is this, how do we retain some sense of being able to critique ourselves and not just go, we're great, we're amazing, but also not lose some of the thanks that we have to those that have gone before us. Thank you. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Bethan, to how you got into all this. I know you've said a little bit. But...
yeah, I did. I think it's a bit like Tamar, what other people have said. I didn't know about the survivor movement. I'm from Wales, so if you look at the history of the survivor movement, there's very little, nothing almost happening in Wales. So I wasn't brought up with this. I wasn't aware of it, and so I did mainstream things, and I don't quit things. I generally stay in things for quite a long time, a number of years. I give them opportunities to change, and as I said, I just felt the longer I was continuing to do these mainstream involvement opportunities, I was being harmed. It was causing me more and more stress because I was feeling like I wasn't being listened to, that I felt really hopeless, that nothing was going to change, and I felt quite invalidated. And that's when I kind of turned my back on a lot of that, because I am someone who's quite action orientated. I see a problem or an issue and I want to do something about it. I want to do something about everything, and I have to be selective about what I do, and I want to do it and I'm going to do it. And a way to use that energy was to work with the survivor movement, doing our own things. Pop-up things like Mad COVID was a response to the lack of response initially from the mental health charities and the NHS. I was frustrated, so I was like, what am I going to do? Then Stop-Sin, you know, and the Calm trial and things like that. So I find it's a way I can influence and enact change much quicker than I could if I went through the system. And so yeah, that's why I got in it. I really find it really interesting though about what Jess just said about the historical influence, and I think we do really need to recognise the leadership of the people who have created this environment now for us to be able to do these things. And Alison Faulkner is a massive hero of mine, or heroine of mine, because when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I was reading a paper on crisis services, and Alison Faulkner, service survivor researcher. What is a survivor researcher? It was like a totally revolutionary concept to me, that someone with a mental health condition could be a researcher. Coming from Wales, where we also don't have peer support workers, we don't really have people with lived experience working in the NHS out in that type of role, and we don't have, for example, where Stan works at the Shaw Centre in King's College, we don't have anything like that in Wales either. So there are limited opportunities for me where I am, and that's why social media and grassroots organisations and groups was the place I headed, I guess.
Getting so tempted to go into what sustains you, because it seems like there's some inspiration in the room at the moment, but I'm aware that if we don't talk about some of the challenges, we'll have a really great group hug or something. But actually this stuff is hard sometimes, and some of you have alluded to that already, and I guess I'm interested in, what do you think some of the main challenges are that you have been through in this journey, or that you're continuing to face? Is anyone interested in speaking to that?
I can. And one of the challenges is just what I've shown just then, which is like an impulsivity to speak when I out in terms of when I kind of witness an injustice, and I feel as if that's a kind of challenge in itself, because I do have this impulsivity to speak truth to power, as the saying goes, but that doesn't come from a sense of confidence. It comes from an impulse. That I'm now relating more and more to autism, and that, you know, social justice, and kind of feeling super aligned with that way of being. You could well link it with that, but you know, so the toll that speaking out can have after speaking out can be immense. You know, vulnerability hangover, if you like. But then within kind of the voluntary sector specifically, there's a lot. I feel like, and I kind of spoke about this in my introduction, that, you know, there's a right way of being mad, and generally the Freudian slip there. I said the right way of being mad is the white way of being mad, and if institutions that we're working with are kind of white institutions generally, and we're being managed by white people, when I bring my lived experience of being a racialized woman into it, it's been very hard for people to hear. And, you know, there's been kind of a mimicking of what's happened to me in my life in psychiatric services and psychology service. You know, I'm told that what I'm experiencing isn't real. And that can be so painful. You know, to bring my vulnerability to the work. You know, it's why I'm being paid, partly as well as strategy and stuff. It's why the service is being funded, and yet it's only acceptable sometimes. Yeah, so I found that particularly very, very, very painful, especially, you know, there's a lot of consciousness raising around racialized issues, Black Lives Matter, and yeah, that's not made life easier, to be honest. So yeah, systemically induced paranoia is what I would call it.
And that's huge as well, this sense of conditional acceptance. Anything anyone else would want to add?
I guess you were asking about the negative things.
Yeah, the challenges.
Well, there are huge challenges, aren't there? Like you, Jess, I feel compelled to say or do things, even though I know it has and will have a negative impact on how people perceive me, my well-being, but I can't stop myself. It's just innate, and I just feel that I have to do something like stop sin. You know, that took a tremendous toll on all of us. But we felt that we had to do it. We felt that we had to do it. And so, yes, I do feel also that the harm in terms of not being credible, you know, extends to lots of mad people and how we may present. And a lot of people, particularly academics, don't like the way I talk to them. And so they kind of ignore me, which actually perpetuates the harm, that you feel you're not being heard. And I wish people just listen to the message and not how it's being delivered, because often the message has something really powerful in it, and people often can't control or aren't able to articulate the message in a way that is acceptable to middle-class white people. And I do think in the survivor movement, we need to open spaces for different forms of leadership. And in one way, I don't want to change myself, because I want to try and make it more acceptable for people to maybe act or say things differently, to be taken seriously. I think we need to step out of this model of being balanced and whatever, because sometimes outrage is a correct response. So I think I would like to see in our movement that we had more acceptance of people who convey things in different ways. Anyway, it has a tremendous personal cost, like I'm sure Tamar will talk about.
Yeah, just to unmute myself. Yeah, I was just I always sort of get inspired when Bethan speaks, because I think we're very we've probably got very similar approaches. I think we think very similarly. But I don't know if it's just sort of exploding at things, but yeah, it does have a massive toll. I've spent most of the last month in bed. You know, I've done quite a bit of activism-y type work, so you know, I've been arranging mad studies that's going to be tomorrow. I'll facilitate that, yay. But I've been arranging that from my bed and sending emails from my bed, you know, and part of that has been because of yeah, getting knocked. You know, you put your head above the parapet and you get knocked down, and when you get knocked down, it hurts. It really, really hurts. And it hurts in, I think there's ways. It can be from within the institution, where you've I think recently I've had something where I've fought very hard with other people. We thought we had something, and then it just feels as though all of our work has been sort of knocked over like a Jenga tower. But also, you know, you put your head above the parapet, and the worst thing that can happen is if you feel as though people in your own community have punched you down. That's the bit that hurts the most. And I think that's one of the bits that one of the things that you say within your report too. And I was also thinking something that Jess had said about racialized abuse as, sorry, racialized abuse, but I was thinking particularly racialized gaslighting, and how in your report where you talked about gaslighting, and it's only been very, very recently that I've even been able to understand how much that gaslighting even exists. I didn't really have a vocabulary for it, you know, and then suddenly, you know, it's starting to realize that it's there, and it's there for everybody. But then you think about intersections, and you think about, well, if it's there for everyone, so you've got your lived experience professionals, and if it's there as a structure for all of us, how much more so if you fit on the intersection of being somebody who isn't white, being somebody who isn't psi, being someone who's LGBT, you know, just being someone from a different marginalized community, or from, you know, it kind of there are things that we often I think we don't even know them ourselves, and that can make it even worse. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that, but it's just that when I heard you both talking about that, it just kind of tugged at me, and I just felt like I had to say it.
And I think just to very quickly kind of reflect on that as well, for me, it comes down to how can we actively reflect on what we've been told leadership is in every moment of doing what others might call leadership, and how can we just turn that on its head and do it in a way that is uplifting, nourishing, not only to ourselves but to the folks we're working with. And how do you build those kind of, they're almost like supportive care kind of networks to be able to then thread these conversations through. So, you know, this is the first time I've been in a conversation around this, and it feels like I am learning a lot from everyone who's speaking. And it's, you know, I feel others should definitely have access to these kinds of conversations as well. So, you know, Ray, with the report and everything, it can really set that ground for thinking differently, and reflecting on, you know, everything that's told us what a leader is and what a leader isn't, you know, so we can imagine a different future, and, you know, really challenge and dismantle a lot of the structures that have kept us very much in the places that we're in.
And part of me is going to this, what could a leader be? And you guys may want to pick up on some of what each others have said. But I guess where I'd like to go is this idea of nourishing and uplifting each other and ourselves. What is it that can support us, and what supports you and sustains you in amongst all of these challenges that you're facing on a minute by minute daily basis? This might be something personal to you, or it could be something that you think as a wider network we can give for each other. Yeah, Tamar.
Yes, Sharanjeet's just sort of mentioned it, or one thing really, which is you said about how I can't remember the word that you used, but I'm just going to say nourishing, like the conversation is, or, you know, helpful the conversation is, and it would be, you know, helpful for other people. And definitely it's something where I think when I'm able to speak to other people that have the same experience, there's something about them legitimizing that experience. So particularly when I've had that experience of gaslighting and almost not believing myself, then to be able to hear other people share their experiences, then that has, you know, it's helped so much. Or something like MAD studies, where we're all getting together, at the end of it, oh, it feels so amazing. You know, we're not there particularly talking about, you know, we're talking about whatever the subject is, but it's so great kind of all getting together, and we often leave feeling really sort of uplifted. So but yeah, I think being with other people and sharing experiences for me is a big one.
Thank you. Jess?
I was just going to say, yeah, peer support for lived experience leaders, I think is brilliant. And I think that with COVID, there's been, you know, a lack of opportunity for that, especially like the kind of peer support that would come from just bumping into each other at events and stuff like that. So maybe organised, built-in kind of spaces for that are needed, definitely. I think external supervision in terms of like the voluntary sector could be useful, because I think with managers generally, they've got the charity to think about, and, you know, do they actually have lived experience themselves, and, you know, that they're wearing multiple hats. And I think to support somebody with lived experience is a real kind of niche. So external supervision, I think, is useful. I think that critique of the the non-profit industrial complex has been really helpful for me, seeing the voluntary sector as just another system with a hierarchy. It might be a kind of a softer, more hidden hierarchy, but actually I found that quite difficult because rules haven't been explicit. And yeah, so, you know, I've asked for permission for things when maybe I should have just gone and done them. And maybe if I had sorry, white guys, but maybe if I had the confidence of a white man, I could just go and do it. But yeah, I think I asked for permission too much. Yeah, so understanding the hierarchy, I think, can be helpful. Also, I suppose related to the industrial complex of non-profits is kind of work not loving you back. You know, there's that book by what's she called, Sarah Jaff. You know, I think part of why we're so good at what we do is because we put our all into it. We work overtime. We care about this. It's our life. But having all of my identity wrapped up in the work has been so painful when it goes wrong. So kind of like a step away from, I suppose, seeing myself as necessary and seeing it as more of like a collective fight. But I think, you know, does this work fit well into the charitable sector? No, because the charitable sector is like that, whereas we're trying to build a different future. So yeah, and then I think finally what's been helpful for me is, you know, me giving everything to fighting the fight is actually probably a way of dealing with my own trauma. And is it healing to step away from it? I think it has been very healing for me to step away and then come back. Because yeah, the kind of quote like "get up from the table and love is no longer being served," and walking away has, I think, meant that I haven't had a full-on breakdown. But yeah, so peer support, being a collective, and walking away when you need to save yourself.
Yeah,
I'm going to give Jess a big massive hug now after hearing that. Oh, don't have a breakdown. Yeah.
We're talking about different systems, aren't we? So sometimes people with lived experience work in different systems of the NHS, charitable sector. I'm interested in how we do things outside of those systems. So when we create our own things, and it's like a learning in progress. I feel that I'm learning about what the best way to do things are. Because whilst we want things to be a collective, it's very difficult on a day-to-day basis when something needs a decision, or who's going to make that decision, or if everyone disagrees, who's going to make the decision. And sometimes I think we need to start thinking more about how we articulate that user-led groups work together and how decisions are made. For example, on Mad COVID, we have an admin team and there's 5 of us, and we each have our own areas where we will make the final decision on. So Joe, that's the fund, but we all contribute to the decision making process. But at the end of the day, one person is responsible for that. So I guess it's trying to think of different ways of doing things. I found that helpful because it means that we all get a say in things and generally we reach a consensus, but sometimes there will be disagreement and people will be hurt and things like that. And so I just want to try and think about how we move forwards and, you know, make sure we don't replicate the systems in the third sector and in the NHS, but we've got to be pragmatic sometimes. So you have to do stuff and people have to make decisions. So what I have found helpful is peer support, and having, after about 7 or 8 years in the service user movement, having really good, knowing where my allies are, knowing who I can trust. But that comes with time, and people who are new to this don't have the luxury of knowing who is a good support and who is not. But yeah, peer support was a massive thing for the Stop Sim Coalition. We had that through Peer Hub and Ensign, and all of us would have been seriously at risk had we not had that. So it was crucial. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
Thank you, that's huge. I can see we've got a question come in, but Sharanjit, you might have something you want to add. I think you kind of started this, so perhaps you've said what you want to say. I'm not sure.
I think just a quick addition is just, I value one of the things I value the most in terms of, you know, what supports me to feel welcome, to feel comfortable, and to feel myself are spaces where you can hold multiple identities. And I think Panelists earlier mentioned what it meant to be really mad, or like why, like all these different things that potentially when we enter different spaces we feel as though we have to shift ourselves to be something else in that space. And so I think within the kind of lived experience space, it's been the majority of the time it's been very nice to be there in my entirety, in a sense, because there are aspects of my identity that have otherwise been pushed away and otherwise kind of been like very much rejected from other spaces. So kind of even my kind of faith identity, being a Sikh man, and for me that is very much intrinsic in the work I do. It kind of fuels and enables and really motivates how I kind of exist in this temporary world. And I'm glad that I mentioned that now, because otherwise, there are other spaces where you feel unable to mention that, or you feel as though, oh, this isn't something to talk about here. But I think by having these kinds of conversations and by bringing these different aspects of us that we want to bring into the conversation and feeling accepted, feeling at home, and feeling supported it's a very powerful thing. I think we have a really fantastic opportunity to kind of continue with that here.
Thank you. As a multiple, it kind of this idea of bringing my whole selves in is still something I'm working on, I think. We've got a question from Paul. Most of my knocks have been at the hands of people who I would have regarded as one of us. It's left me very frightened, not knowing where I'm safe. If we can't work together when we have such obvious common ground, then what hope is there for the rest of the world? I know we've talked a little bit about this already, but I'm wondering, do any of you have any words that you want to, Bethan?
I just want to say that Paul has raised a really, really important point that we need to address as a community of service users and survivors. What do we do? Because service users are going to be in elevated positions in charities and the NHS, and even in user-led groups as well, or in academia. And I feel like, mostly we have been following the traditional trajectory of leadership, moving up, and these are the things that are associated with this or that banding or whatever in position. So we've been forced into the leadership model of these organisations, and we need to think differently. But I think we need to talk about this, and I think it's a serious issue. And you can feel all alone, and it can feel really, really horrible. I've been in a situation like Paul, and you just don't know where you're safe to go. What I have realised, though, there are clear divisions in the survivor community, unfortunately, over diagnosis, over trans rights, gender identity, that make it hard for one unified survivor movement to exist. I think there are significant factions, and I think people can get hurt. But I think it's a much wider conversation. I'm just so sorry, Paul, that you've experienced that.
Yeah, I'm aware we've got 2 minutes left before we're closing, so I'm just going to say, has anyone else on the panel got something they want to say to that before we close? Yeah, Jess.
This is a bit of a sneaky one because it is responding, but it's also saying something else. I mean, so responding, I found it, so I definitely had, if you like, a view of the survivor movement and a view of certain institutions as if they would be a safe place in my home, and I've been sorely disappointed. So to me, it's like there's something in all movements, all institutions, if you're going to call the service user movement an institution, having factions and having hierarchies in terms of race, gender, blah blah blah. There's so, for instance, in the socialist movement, there's a big issue with kind of white male people taking up too much space, even though I relate to socialist values, but anyway, that's another story. And that brings in the values. For me, a real protective thing has been values, sort of values of intentional peer support, really. You know, that, and Tamar, you mentioned that before. I feel like that is something, if I'm thinking that I'm being positioned as mad or doubting my reality, if I come back to those values, I feel safe. And that is where I find my safe space and my home. It's in those values.
Thank you. Oh, we have run out of time, but that feels like a really solid place to be ending this panel. I'd like to thank each one of you for taking part in it, for our interpreters, and also everyone that's come and listened either within the Zoom room or later on YouTube. I hope that this is one of many conversations that we'll keep on having, and that we can work together to try and create this space where we're nourishing and uplifting each other, rather than this sense of pain that's also been in the room. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the next keynote. I'm looking forward to tuning into it.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, everyone.